Hello and welcome to the Atlas Agency, a channel all about Arkham Horror, the card game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host Brandon, and today I'll be sharing my thoughts on the new scenario content in the Forgotten Age Deluxe box. The Forgotten Age is the third Deluxe box for Arkham Horror, the card game. As with the previous Deluxe expansions, it kicks off a brand new campaign. Each of the Arkham campaigns that we've seen so far has had its own flavor to help set the campaigns apart from one another and to help keep the experience fresh. We've just come off the more internally focused psychological horror of the Path to Carcosa, where the underlying reality of the story was always in question. The Forgotten Age now deliberately heads in quite a different direction. This is a pulp adventure story. It's Lovecraft with a dash of Indiana Jones. The story opens here in the Deluxe box with the players leading an expedition into the rainforests of southern Mexico in search of evidence of a lost civilization. As with the game's previous Deluxe boxes, there are two new scenarios here, along with all the encounter sets that will be used over the course of the Cycles campaign. Of course, it also includes the campaign guide covering these two scenarios, and one thing I thought was cool was, for the first time, the back page of this campaign guide now has a legend showing the name and symbol for each of the new encounter sets in the box. That's something the Dunwich and Carcosa campaign guides didn't have, and while it's not essential, I do like having it, and I hope that they continue to do that for future cycles. Before I talk about the new scenarios themselves, I'm going to talk through the new mechanics and keywords that are introduced in the Forgotten Age. It's important to introduce these because they're featured pretty heavily in both of the new scenarios. They really drive the experience in this box in a way we haven't seen in previous Deluxe boxes. First up is Alert. Alert is a pretty simple new keyword that appears on enemies. It's basically a cousin to the Retaliate keyword that triggers on failed evasion attempts instead of on failed attacks. So if you fail an evasion attempt against an enemy with Alert, then that enemy immediately attacks you. Pretty easy to grasp, though personally I have found it's easy to forget about in play. I think that's because evade has been a safe action for so long. Failing an evade usually hasn't had extra consequences, so sometimes it's not until after I've already pulled out the Chaos token that I realize I forgot to consider the risk of triggering Alert. One of the Forgotten Age's themes is putting extra importance on agility and evasion, and Alert is part of that. It's basic enough, though, that it feels like it could stand to be an evergreen keyword that continues to see use beyond just the Forgotten Age cycle. Another new mechanic in this box that plays into that Evasion Matters theme is Vengeance. Vengeance points are basically the evil opposite of victory points. If you defeat an enemy or resolve a treachery with Vengeance X, it gets placed into the victory display, or if you clear all the clues off a location with Vengeance X, it goes to the victory display during the resolution of the scenario. These points are referenced by card effects and are also tallied in your campaign log, and they do bad things. You want to avoid Vengeance points as much as you can. Vengeance emphasizes evasion because if you can deal with an enemy by evading it instead of killing it, then you can avoid picking up those Vengeance points. I think this one's in an interesting spot right now. There are effects in the Deluxe box scenarios that penalize Vengeance, but I think it's really the fear of the unknown, of what these points might mean later in the campaign, that's really driving me to try to avoid Vengeance at the moment. So far I'm liking this dynamic, both from a gameplay perspective and from a thematic perspective. It does do a great job of evoking the original Curse of Yig's story through the gameplay. You do not want to mess with Yig's children, or else it's going to come back to bite you. The next thing to talk about is supplies. This is a new campaign element introduced here to support the adventure theme. Basically, before you start your campaign, each investigator is given a limited number of supply points to spend on a shopping list of adventuring supplies. Things like medicine or torches or a compass. There are a decent number of items on the list, and you don't have enough points to buy everything, so you have to make some hard decisions on what to take. The exact number of points you get to spend per investigator varies based on the player count. For each player you add, the budget per player drops. Then at different points in the campaign, you'll be directed to check your supplies to see whether you have certain items, and effects will be modified accordingly. So having one thing might make a part of a scenario easier or allow you to take a special action, or you might be penalized for something you neglected to take. Your initial choice is pretty much blind. You maybe have some guesses about what looks valuable, but you don't really know what anything's going to do. Once you're familiar with the scenarios, though, it becomes an extra strategic layer to consider. So far, I've really enjoyed supplies. I think I've sort of developed some favorite supplies that I always want to have, but I think it'll be interesting to see how those priorities change as different supplies take prominence in future scenarios. While I like supplies from a gameplay perspective, I do think they're a little odd thematically, or at least they can be, just because you already have a deck of player cards that represents your physical assets. Sometimes the supply checks conflict with your in-play items. For example, if I have a flashlight or a lantern in play as an asset card, that won't help me when the scenario asks me to check my supplies for torches. So that breaks the immersion a little bit, but the system is fun enough that I can easily forgive it. Finally, there's the mechanic that casts the biggest shadow on this deluxe box, and that's Explore. Explore is a new action designator. Certain scenarios in this campaign will have you build what's called an exploration deck during setup. This consists of some single-sided locations, plus some treachery cards. When an ability lets you explore, you draw the top card of the exploration deck, and then check whether it matches a location type specified by the Explore ability. Usually that's a location connected to your current location. If it matches the criteria, you put that location into play, and then you immediately move there. If not, you draw again. If at any point you hit a treachery, you resolve that treachery and then stop drawing, and the exploration is considered unsuccessful. That treachery then gets discarded to the normal encounter discard pile. Otherwise, you keep drawing until you hit a location that does match. In practice, this plays sort of like a movement action with an uncertain outcome. You don't know exactly which location you might end up at, and there's the possibility you'll hit a treachery and then not move at all. Quick tip on Explore, I think it's helpful if, after playing your first few games and encountering all the locations, you stop and lay out all of the locations and arrange them so you can visualize the full layout of the scenario map with all the connections. The maps aren't actually that complicated, but they can feel that way when you're discovering locations one at a time during play. If you can review the full picture, then in future games you'll have a better sense of how to lay things out in a way that makes sense and that keeps you from constantly having to rearrange locations on the board. Those are the major new mechanics, and as I said, the experience in this deluxe box is really built around them, especially Explore. And that leads to what I would say is the thing that struck me the most about this deluxe box, and that's how similar the two scenarios feel. You could certainly point to differences between the two, some different minor hooks, and of course mostly different cards, but structurally I would say that these felt very similar to one another. It's not even just that they're similar for two scenarios from the same box. I'm not sure you could pick up any pair of scenarios from the entire Dunwich campaign, or the whole Carcosa campaign, and say that they're more similar than this pair. This is a feeling I haven't felt with either of the previous deluxe boxes, not even close. I love both Curtain Call and The Last King from the Path to Carcosa deluxe box, but those two scenarios have very different feels and different structures. And I think it certainly makes sense to aim for variety in an expansion like this that has two scenarios packaged together, especially since campaigns roll out slowly, and for a while I imagine a lot of people who are caught up on the other releases will be playing this latest campaign more than anything else. To be fair, thematically it does feel right to have these scenarios structured the way they are. With the story behind them being what it is, I don't think you could justify not using Explore or Supplies or Vengeance in either scenario, but I think a little more could have been done to try to use these, especially Explore and Supplies, in ways that felt more sharply different between the two scenarios. There's certainly room for several twists on these. It's pretty easy to brainstorm what you could do differently with Explore. I fully expect that we will see those twists as the campaign develops, but I really felt their absence here. There's also a bit of encounter set overlap between the two scenarios. That's something the Dunwich and Carcosa boxes both avoided. One set is a special case that was reused for an obvious reason, and that one's fine, but the other one that's reused is not really a special case, so having it appear in both scenarios means you'll just see some of the same threats twice. I understand card counts can be tight in these deluxe boxes, but still, it adds to that feeling of déjà vu. Another thing I want to mention briefly that applies to both scenarios is the difficulty. Both of these scenarios are pretty challenging. There was a step up in difficulty in the Path to Carcosa Deluxe box, and I think that these scenarios step it up yet again. Those two things taken together, the similarity between the scenarios and the high difficulty level, make me think that this is probably not an ideal second step into the game for a new player. You're going to get better scenario variety and probably a more enjoyable play experience starting with Dunwich or Carcosa. You can certainly make Forgotten Age work if the theme really excites you or if for some reason you can't get your hands on the earlier boxes, but I think moving in order is still ideal. Now over on the player card side, I will concede that some of the investigators in the Forgotten Age box actually work decently well with just two cores in this box. Leo Anderson, for example, but on the scenario side, again, I think you're probably better off moving with one of the other boxes first. In terms of the theme, immersion, and story, I think that this box is pretty solid, the artwork as well. It all comes together to successfully deliver on that adventure theme. If I wasn't so biased in favor of the Path to Carcosa's themes, I would probably tell you that I think the story material here in Forgotten Age is the best we've seen in the game so far, and there seems to be a lot of it too. That's the way it feels at least. I didn't compare it with a Carcosa booklet. It could very well be comparable length, that seems likely, but it's got to be more story text in here than the Dunwich box. I want to hit the individual scenarios just briefly. The first scenario in the box is titled The Untamed Wilds. This one has a jungle exploration theme. As you might expect, it's really about introducing the campaign's new mechanics, and I think it's quite successful in that goal, especially in presenting Explore in its basic form. This is really an explore-driven scenario. I would say Untamed Wilds is actually my favorite of the two scenarios in the box. I think it does a pretty good job of conveying that jungle exploration theme. The bright outdoor setting is kind of a nice change of pace from the kinds of locations we're used to seeing in Arkham, and while it is pretty challenging, I've enjoyed the process of learning the scenario over multiple plays and kind of refining my approach. The second scenario is The Doom of Estley. From a thematic standpoint, I really enjoyed this scenario, especially the final act. It's got some great imagery that really clicks for me. It feels like something taken out of a story or a movie, though I can't actually pinpoint any specific story that it reminds me of. But while it succeeds there, I found that I don't especially like the gameplay in this one. This one has a Doom token theme that just doesn't really excite me, and while I love the story events of the scenario's last act, I'm not in love with the way it tends to play out in the game, in part because there are a few player cards that can swing that last act from being difficult to being basically trivial. And lastly, once again, I think Doom could have done more to distinguish itself from Untamed Wilds. Overall, I would say The Forgotten Age is my second favorite deluxe box on the scenario front out of the 3 deluxe boxes we've had so far. Compared to Dunwich, I think Forgotten Age has a much stronger story and a slightly more enjoyable set of scenarios, but for me, it doesn't quite hit the highs of the Carcosa deluxe box. Both of the Carcosa scenarios are still in my all-time top 10, and I don't think either of these new scenarios would quite make that list. But if the pulp adventure theme resonates better with you than Carcosa's questioning of reality, and if you appreciate a good challenge, then you might very well prefer Forgotten Age. I think it lays the groundwork for a solid campaign, and I'm quite interested to see where it goes from here, and to see how those new mechanics develop. That'll wrap us up for this look. As always, thanks for watching the Atlas Agency. I do appreciate your viewership. I'll be back in the near future with more on The Forgotten Age. In the meantime, good luck in your own investigations of the mythos.